Okay, join me as I get CakePHP working with CakeDC Auth plugin, and basically it's going to be a simple role-based access control system, and we're going to make modifications to let the user know when they've been denied in the interface. So to get started, it's simply a matter of creating a CakePHP installation using Composer, and I'm going to call it posts. So I'm using VS Code and a couple of extensions as well. Okay, so we now open the project as in that folder, get a terminal running, and then do bin cake server, and then connect to the instance there of Cake running. Now we can see that our first issue when we get the home page up is that it hasn't got a database, so let's create a database. I use MySQL Workbench, leaving the defaults. They're pretty good because they use multi-byte collation and all that sort of stuff, so just leaving the defaults, and create a user with access to posts, create the user, and then give ourselves privileges to the database. And that should be about right. Now we go back into our Cake installation, go into app.local or app_local, and then just make those changes. We'll do it. So I'm holding Shift and Alt down in Windows to get this to work. And that made had the cursor in the wrong spot there, but that's all good. So once you have the details for the default database specified, you should then be able to go back to your home page and it will say CakePHP is able to connect to the database. So the next step is we need some database tables, and we can create create a add posts and users table, create a migration, which is with a nice and descriptive name, and then begin to fill in the add column, call that username, and then we go add column, and we want that to be password, and we need to specify the type, and what else do we need? We can say add timestamps. Now we need to specify the cake friendly names for timestamps, because basically if we don't, then what happens is the bake functionality, Cake has this ability to create the model, the view and the controllers automatically, and if you don't name them created and modified, then it doesn't automatically sort of create the right framework for that. Okay, so now we've got add column. We need a column called isSuperUser, because we're going to use a policy to allow the superuser to go anywhere and do anything. So we add a field that's Boolean. By default, we're going to make it so that no one is a superuser. You have to specify that yourself. And it's called role-based access control, so we need a column for the role as well to handle the role. Now, when you are creating a migration, if the table already exists, then this should be update, but if it doesn't exist, then it needs to be a create. So we also need let's call table called posts, and we want a column which will be the title of the post, and it's a string, and we want the body of the post is another string, and we want to make a column for ownership. Now, when we're creating the users table, we don't have to specify an ID column, because by default the Cake migration will create an ID column with auto increment and its primary key, so we don't need to do that. We don't specify that at all. Now, what else do we need for this? I think that's everything. So we just right. So now we've created a migration. We can then run it to apply it. Bin cake migrations. If we hit status, we can see that it's not been run yet. But if we then go migrations migrate, and then we go have a look at our database, we can see that we now have 3 tables. Finks log is what's keeping track of the migrations. So each migration is entered there. And then we have the 2 tables that we've created. So the ID field, as we mentioned, is being added to both of them as a default. And here we see everything's been created for us by the migration, which is great, because this then allows you to basically add migrations on migrations, continue to create migrations, and you can really keep track of all your database changes by using a migration. It's very handy, good for upgrades and those sorts of things. Alright, so our next step is to make a change to the application. Actually, our next step is to go cake bin cake bake. Let's have a look. So we've got this ability to bake all sorts of different things, but what we really want to do is do a bake all. So we're going to get models, views, controllers, everything created in one go. So bake all, and then we just specify we want posts to be baked and we want users to be baked. Now, what does that work out to be? Well, it means that when we go to users here, we've already got our views. We can create new users and all that sort of stuff. It's all created for us, and that works well. So let's begin by going to the CakePHP website, and let's start to scaffold out the authentication and authorization, which we'll then build on top of that to add simple role-based authentication using the Cake Auth DC plugin. So to get ourselves started though, let's create a new user, and we'll call this user admin, and give him a role of admin. Now notice our first issue, if we have a look at the database, is we've got an unencrypted password. So password at the moment is 123. So let's begin the process of making that so that that's secure and it's not encrypted. So we go to the authentication part of our tutorial in the Cake tutorial and pull in our first package. Now if I hit enter right now with this package the way it is, it will quickly come back to me and say I can't install this because of a number of reasons. It's saying it needs PHP 7.1 and I've got 8.1.6 there. But if we remove the version constraint, it will then go out and find the latest version and it will successfully install. So what's the next step? We've already done our bake all to create the users table, but now what we need to do is go and put a function into our user entity which will take the plain text password and then encrypt it for us. So let's go and do that first. So we go user.php, it's the user entity. We go down to the bottom here and just pop in our set password functionality so that when it receives a plain text password from the form, it will take it and use a password hasher. Now, as you can see, this is saying we don't have this class, so I have an extension. If I just show you that, it's called the PHP namespace resolver. So you can install that and then just import this class. If there's multiple classes with the same name, it'll just say which one you want to import. I don't think that matters, but there we go. And so we now have that password being encrypted. Now what do we need to do? We've got a few things that need to happen in order to get authentication working. So let's start. So it's giving us, you need to go into this file, source application, and add these imports. So let's do that. Source application. We'll just pop that in there, and it's saying that we need to implement this authentication server provider interface on this class. So let's pop that in there. Now notice that it's saying undefined type. Now we know we've installed the package, but it's saying undefined type. So if you Control-Shift-P and then choose the reload window, so you enter that, it will then go and find, it will then refresh, and this time it now says, okay, you're missing a method that you need to implement. So we need to grab that method, go to the bottom of the file and implement the method. Now in this get authentication service, there's a couple of sets of fields defined here. They're both duplicated, but it basically says, look, when you're identifying a user, the fields I want you to use for username is the email field, for password it's the password field. But as you may have noticed from our migration, I'm using the username field, not an email field. So I'm going to change that now. I'm just going to specify, just going to copy this. Go up the top here and go fields equals and specify, and then change this as well. Now there's something else that's bothering me here, is that what I'd like I've got the IntelliFence. If you have a look at IntelliFence, PHP IntelliFence, I've got this installed, and it does have the feature available to format things. So if you right click and choose format document, it will do that. But I want to just make a quick change to my settings. So I'm going to type in format on, and there we go. Let's see if this makes the change I hope it's going to make. And if I now hit Control S to save, it should automatically format my PHP, which makes it a lot better. Now let's look at our next step, which is, it says after the routing middleware, add the authentication middleware. So we go back to source application, into our middleware function, find the routing middleware, and then enter that code. So obviously if you copy and paste the wrong amount of code, you'll need to just modify it a bit. But right, so that adds our authentication middleware. And now to provide ourselves with the authentication functionality, we need to go into, it says app controller, in the initialize method, and add this authentication component. So let's do that. Just close these things. We go app controller and just go here and add authentication. Now the next step is that it's saying that we need to add some unauthenticated actions, which makes sense, doesn't it? You don't want to have people having to type a password in to get to the login prompt. So what we're going to do now is just go into the users controller, and we can add all of that actually. Go into the users controller and go at the top, just add a before filter method, and that adds an unauthenticated action, which is the login action. Right, so now we need a login template. So we've created the action in the controller, now we need a template, and going to our templates directory, our users, create login PHP, enter that. Now remember we had our username field is username, so we've got to change that to username. And if we go back to our login action, we also have this code that's using from the tutorial but we don't have an articles controller, but we do have a post controller. So by default, I'm just going to say when you successfully log in, so it is valid, the login, go to wherever the query string redirect is pointing, or to this default action here. So we can do that. Now it's saying here that we want to add index and view as unauthenticated, but I like to imagine that my application is no access for anybody. Everyone needs to be authenticated to access any of it, so I'm not going to add these extra unauthenticated actions. Now we have in our users controller, we need to specify a logout action so that user can log out. So we go underneath the login action here and put our logout action and save. So that's nicely done there. And we do want to be able to add, let's say we do want to add registration, so we want to make a change there as well to add two unauthenticated actions. Now at that point, what have we done? We've got pretty much everything's ready. So if we just press enter at the moment while we're here, notice that we've done enough so that now we're being prompted for passwords. Now I've put in a password that I know I've set already, but because we've added all these features, it's now trying to check the password, an encrypted password when it's not encrypted, and all those sorts of things. So let's go back to app controller. I'm just going to comment out the authentication component and see if, alright, and we need to get that, comment that out. Now what I'm just going to do now, if you have a look at our database, you can see that the password is not encrypted. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to change the password and then show you what you see in the database. Right, so I've just changed the password, but now it's encrypted. So now we can go back, because we're now no longer having an issue with, should be able to log in, and we can go to our users controller and our app controller and uncomment those lines of code to now, if we go back and press enter, it says no, you're not authenticated, so we'll redirect you to the login page, and now we can type in our admin username and password and be able to log in. Now notice what it's done there, it's taken us back to where we were before, but let's run our logout and log back in, but this time we don't have a redirect at the top there, so it now takes us back to the place where we tell it to, which is the index view of the post. So that's authentication. We can go once again to the logout and add a user. Let's add user, and we'll go password. We'll just call that user there, and let's see if we can log in as user. Okay, so we've got a user there and an administrator, and this administrator is the super user as well. So remember that as we go through our role-based access control setup. So from this point, we now need to start implementing not just authentication to say, hey, I know who you are, but authorization. I know who you are and you are allowed to access whatever part of the application, because at the moment people can access anything. Another thing we might do, just to make it easy so we know who we're logged in as, is just go make a change to our template to know who's signed in. So I'm going to go into, I'm going to copy this. I'm going to take that from the user's controller, the ball-for filter method, and I'm going to put it into my app controller. And then I'm going to see if I can go set up this logged in user equals this request get attribute identity, or just if there's nothing, just return that, and please set that into the view. So all controllers get a variable named logged in user. Now to have a look at that, let's just reload and then go into our variables, and here we have our logged in user available. Now what we can then do is go back to our templates, into our layout, and we've got some nav links there, but we'll just remove those, and then we'll do a little bit of if logged in user. So if it's not null, let's add this HTML link, and the link title will be logged in user username, and I'll give them the ability to users action log out, and might put a title on that as well and say click here to log out. And then I believe we're getting close. Right. So let's go and see if that does what we want it to. Right. So it just gives us the username and then the ability to log out and log back in as different users. Alright, now let's move further into our authorization. So we've done authentication, let's do authorization. Now again, it's a process of just following the tutorial and remember to remove the version constraint on these later versions of CakePHP, especially if you're using PHP 8.1 plus. Okay, so we've got the authorization plugin. Now we need to start to specify the configuration for that in source application. So just close all these and go source application, and we go into our bootstrap method and put the authorization plugin into there, and then we need to add the settings for, go up the top, and there's our authorization. We want to implement that. Now again, you notice how it's saying undefined, so we can go Control P and a caret and then type in reload, or just Control Shift P and then just reload the window. And then once we do that, we can see that it's now saying, well, you've got to put the get authorization method into place. So let's pop that one in. Go down the bottom and do that. And that's implemented there. And we need to load a component as well. So we go to App Controller to load components. And we go down to our initialize method to do that. What more do we need to do? We need to skip authorization. Now notice it's saying we don't want to authorize these methods either. So there's no authorization for a user to be able to log in, log out, or add or register themselves. So the way I like to do that is I go users controller and I go into the before filter again, and if I go if this request, now I think it's get parem, and the parem I want is action. Let's go back a bit. So in array, so if the action is in this array, so we wanted to add, login, and log out. We want to skip authorization for those. So there we go. So this authorization, skip authorization for those three actions. So that should be right. Let's see what we're missing. We've forgotten to add this. So we need to add AuthorizationMiddleware. So we go back into the application, the middleware method, and then after authentication we can add the authorization middleware, remembering not to copy, just match what you're seeing around it, so just make it look like that. Okay, now let's see what happens when we try to access posts. Notice it raises an exception, authorization required exception. So remember those methods that we said we'd skip the authorization checks. Let's look at add. It allows us. What was the other one? We log in. Now interestingly enough, login will, because we're already logged in, when we do that it will redirect back to post index and we'll get the error message. But if we then go users log out, it will allow us to do that because there's no authorization checks. So that's working as expected right now. Alright, now if we were to continue following this tutorial on authorization, we would start to create policies to give the person that signed in authorization for different types of actions like add action, edit, delete, and those sorts of things. But we're going to now move away from this tutorial and start to implement the CakeDC Auth plugin, which gives us the ability to specify role-based access control, and it's very simple role-based access control. All it requires is that you have an array where you configure which roles are allowed to do what sort of things. So let's start by doing the installation. Okay, so we're going to just ignore all this for the time being, and we're just going to start with the installation. So the first thing is we go composer require CakeDC /auth. All right. So what do we need to do to get this working? So to get started with CakeDC Auth plugin, we need to tell Cake to start doing a new type of authorization, and basically we're going to, this Auth plugin looks at the controller or the plugin or and the action. So it will say, okay, you're going to try and access the post controller and the index action, or you're going to access, you know, the edit or the delete action. So what we need to do is interrupt the request and then basically say, look, is this request matching any allowed roles, and then accept it or deny it with those. So let's implement request, and I think it's AuthorizationMiddleware, and it's simple as that. So implement new request AuthorizationMiddleware. What does that do? What do you see when you're doing that? Well, for starters, when we're doing that, it's saying, look, in order for request authorization middleware to work, I need a policy to work from. So I'm missing a policy, so I'm going to throw this exception. So let's start by implementing some request policies. Now to do that, we have, at the moment, in our authorization, we have, if we look down here, so we've got our authentication service that says who we are, but this one, it says, it takes who we are, our username, and says, oh, look, is this person allowed to access? And at the moment, it's just got an ORM resolver, but we need to flesh this out so that it works with role-based access control. So we start by creating a new type of policy called a new map resolver, which allows us to bundle a bunch of policies together, and with the request authorization middleware, we take the request coming in, and then we map across a new collection. Okay, so we're not auto-completing there, so what we're going to do, just for the time being, I'll just comment that out, and let's go and reload the window. So we've installed CakeDC Auth, but now we need to from the CakeDC Auth plugin, we need to create a bunch of policies that's going to allow us to authenticate users via the role-based access control. Now have a look at this first one. Super user policy. Now this first policy basically says if the person is a super user, just take that and return success. So the way this works is the collection policy bundles the policies together, then it goes through each policy until it reaches a success, and then it returns success, or it will go through the entire chain until it gets to the end, and if it's still no, it will be no, but it will return as soon as it gets a yes from these policies. So if it's a super user, then that policy will be triggered. Now this is the simple way to do the super user policy, but you can actually go into the super user policy and configure, like let's say for example that you can actually specify a different field as you build that policy. So you can do that as well, but we don't need to do it because our field is the default. Now the next policy is the role-based access control. So if you're not a super user, what policies will be applied? And that's this policy. So once we've got that map resolver and all the policies bundled up inside it, what do we then do? Well, we then need to go here and we go, so we've got an ORM resolver, and then we just again move to a new resolver collection. So it's a collection of resolvers, and we put an array in and we say, okay, take that map of policies and take that ORM, bunch of policies and bundle them together, and then when you return your authorization service, just give them all of those so that it can check to make sure access is allowed everywhere. Okay, so that's modified our authorization service. What does it look like now when we go somewhere? Now it's changed. It's saying, look, I've got this user's controller and I'm trying to access the login, but I don't have a policy or a role-based access control policy for that for everybody. So I'm going to return a forbidden exception. So those RBAC policies basically return a forbidden exception. Now let's see how we implement policies to make that work. Right, the next thing we do, let's go down to the vendor directory where the CakeDC Auth plugin is, and let's go into the source, not the source, let's go up one level to the permissions. Now in this config directory it's probably a sample, and it gives you all the different options that you need to be able to specify policies. It shows you that you can use a closure and with some logic in it. It shows you that you can specify star to mean all, or you can put an array of different roles in, or you can just put in what you need to specify the policy. So what we're going to do is we're just going to take a little piece of this part, because we're not using all that other stuff, which a lot of it's got to do with the CakeDC users plugin, which we're not using. So then we go to our config directory and we create a new file and we call it permissions.php. Remember, it's permissions with an S, and we create a PHP file, and in here we start to define our own policies. Now the first policy we need is to say that for all roles and controller, and the controller is the user's controller, we want to bypass I think that's it, bypass auth. Let's see if my memory is serving me well. Nope. What more do we need to enter to make that work? Maybe we need to put some actions in. So we go actions, and having a look back at here, we go it's action, role controller. Okay, so if we go action, and we say we want the add action, we don't want anybody to have to authenticate to that, we don't want anybody to authenticate with that or that, everyone can log out. Let's try that again and see if it works. And no. Let's try log out. Okay, so we're not got there yet. Role, let's notice how I put a typo there. Isn't that interesting? Right, let's try that one more time. And there we go. Alright, so we can hit log out, that's fine. Now if we tried to log back in there, it would just keep redirecting us back to log out, so we don't want to do that. But let's see what happens when we type in. And why am I allowed to do that? Well, if we type in user, let's see what happens. Alright, so what you've just noticed there is that if we log in as super user, the policy is they can access everything, so they're not being restricted at all. So how do we then start building a role-based access control so that the user can do what they need to do and they're not restricted? Well, let's have a look at our policies. And here we go. So we see that we've got let's create a policy first for, so we go role equals admin and controller equals, let's make that for user, and the controller is everywhere and the action is everywhere. And if we leave it like that, what we'll find is that by default you've got a key here that's got allowed, and the default is true. So if you leave it unspecified, it's true. So it's always allowed. So we can leave it off. But now we go back to here, log in as user, and notice because we've specified that the user can go anywhere, even the users table, it can now do anything. But at the moment that we remove that ability, you'll find that, let's change it to admin. We try it, we're logged in as the user right now. If we try and reload, we'll get the forbidden exception. Alright, the next step is to get our application so that we can do what we need to do. So we know that the super user gets access everywhere, it's allowed for everything. And generally what you'll do when you have an admin role is you'll just give admin access to everything, and that's fine as well. But with our user role, what do we want to user role to be able to do? Well, generally we want the user role to be able to go to the, so we specify user and we say controller. Now we could say that as an array, we could say posts like that and put as many controllers in, or we could say staff for all controllers. And with the action we can say, okay, I want them to be able to, definitely users want to be able to add a post, definitely want them to be able to view their posts and other people's posts, and I want them to be able to see an index view. So when we've done that, we can see that we go back to posts and we're logged in as the user. We can add a user, user title, user body. Now that clearly is a bad idea, isn't it? Being able for the user to be able to specify the user ID of the post. So we might want to make some changes there. Let's do that now. Firstly, I know that user is user2, so I'll just leave that as run. That's good. Right, let's clean some of the things up here that we're seeing. So user ID, we really want to be able to see the user name there, don't we? And challenge when you bake things with Cake is sometimes it makes an intelligent guess and it's not right. So what we're going to do, we're going here into the users table and setting the display field for the user. So when we do that and we go reload, when we go, let's say we edit this, no, we're gonna just going in the wrong place at the wrong time. Yes. So here we go add it and add, and we can now see that the display field is completing properly, and we've got that working well. So in the post index method, let's change, close all these tables down. Let's go posts index and go in and fix this so we know that the post has a user. We want the, not the ID to be displayed, but the username. So we'll go and refresh that. Right, that makes a lot more sense. Now, what else did we see wrong with our views that we definitely don't want? Well, when a user, we definitely don't want a user to be able to change the user ID for a post. So we need to go into the post controller and go down to the add, and here we can go post user ID equals this request get attribute identity, and we can do this, we can say get identifier, and that should then, when a user adds, that should just work well there. So let's say, let's add a post, title 2, body 2, and we should now have that automatically being assigned to the correct user. Now we've still got the issue where if we attempt to view, we're okay. But if we attempt to edit a post, it says forbidden exception. And if we attempt to delete a post, it says forbidden exception. So now we need to start creating some sort of sensible feedback to the user to say, you're not allowed to access that area. So I'll just close down the those screens, and if we go back into our application, source application, what are we seeing? Well, we're seeing that when an exception is raised, it's just giving us the raw exception. And what we need to do is to handle that exception and do something sensible with it. So when we're not authorized, what do we want? So when we're not authorized, what do we want to do? And here where it gets interesting. So if we go into our authorization middleware, we can actually define in the authorization middleware what we want to do when somebody's not authorized. Now at the moment, I'll show you this, I've just pasted this in, but at the moment what's happening is we're seeing basically, I think this is what's happening at the moment. So if we go to this exception handler, if we go down into our vendor directory into CakePHP, down into authorization, down into source, into exceptions, I think that's the wrong place, but we're actually, I think it's, again, I'm going into the wrong spot, but let's go here, policy, here we go, middleware, no, there we are, I'm in the wrong spot. So there it is, we're looking at, so we need to go to vendor, CakePHP authorization. So let's go back up there, authorization, middleware, unauthorized handler. Okay, so in this authorization plugin, there's a number of different ways we can handle exceptions. Now, just to show you what it does by default, I'll just import that class and import that class as well, just so that it's not going to blow up. So when we try to do something we're not allowed to, we get this forbidden exception. And this forbidden exception is basically just thrown. So if we have a look at this exception handler here, this class that's doing the handling at the moment, all it's doing is it's being fed the exception and then straight away it's just throwing it again. But what we would like to happen is that the user clicks on something they aren't allowed to, then gets a sensible error message back to say, hey, you're not allowed to do that. So what we're doing in this source application file is we're basically saying when you get an unauthorized exception of any of these types of exceptions here, use this class name to handle that exception. And by default, I want you, when we're handling these exceptions, I want you to go to this URL and and handle it like that. So what we're going to do now is just set up things so that they work. So let's use a different handler. So another one of the authorization middleware handlers, and see what happens. So if I now go to this edit, now what you'll see is that suddenly we're getting a different error message. So basically I'm trying to access something that's not allowed, but it's logging us back to, it's an endless loop basically. It's going to log in, it's redirecting us to log in. We're already logged in, so then it's redirecting us back to post edit, and we don't have permission, so it's an endless loop. But let's start to make it a bit more sensible. So we'll go somewhere that we're allowed to go. Alright, so the user is allowed to view things like that. If we hit edit, again, let's see what happens. Again, the same issue, endless redirects around in circles. So now what we're going to do is set up our handling to tell the user something sensible. Now, this CakeRedirectHandler, going back to here, it's here. And what we want to do with this is we're going to modify it so it makes a sensible redirect to let the user know that there's a problem. So how do we go about doing that? Well, what I like to do is obviously we're going to extend this. So let's go back up to our directory here in our source directory, and we're going to duplicate the middleware, and then we're going to say another folder, UnauthorizedHandler, and then we're going to create a new file, and I'm going to call that redirect when denied. So I'm going to do some PHP, class is redirect when denied, and it extends the CakeRedirectHandler, and we certainly need to add a namespace for this, and we would also like to import this class. Okay. Now, what do we need to do here? We want to, whenever we're handling an exception, we've got a handle method. But CakeRedirectHandler extends the redirect handler here, and we want to override this handle method so that we basically, right, we're missing a few of these imports, so we'll go back to here, sorry, wrong one, up the top, and put some imports in. And get rid of that one, it's not used. Okay. So let's pop this one in. So now we're going to say, instead of using that CakeRedirectHandler, we want you to use redirect when denied. So we need to import that as well. And go to posts again, try and do it, and we're still back at exactly the problem. We're in an internal redirect. So now we know that we're passing the unauthorized exception to this redirect when denied. We know the exception that's thrown when RBAC gives us a no is forbidden exception. So what do we want to do with it? So this is where we need to do some checking. So we want to say if, and we've got a request that's coming in, that's where we can get attribute identity. If there is no user defined, well, it's quite right that we redirect back to user login. So if no user, redirect to user's login page, yeah? Otherwise, what would we like to do? Well, what I'd like to happen is that when the user clicks on something they're not allowed to do, is they stay where they are and just get a notification that they've done something that they're not allowed to do. So to do that, we get a reference to the referrer. So we go request, I think it's, I'm not sure, so what we'll have to do is, I'm going to type in this variable so that I can remember request server request, and it's request. I'm just going to import that, and the one I want is CakeHTTP server request. So from now on we should, there it is. Okay, so we want referrer. Now generally you could leave this referrer to be a local address, which is a relative address, but I've found that when I'm developing inside a Docker container or something like that, that messes things up because it doesn't give a full URL. So I usually say false there to give me a full URL, which a full URL is http example.com posts, etc. Or and a local URL is just that. So I kind of prefer to give them a full, this one. So what do we do with the referrer now? Well, what we'd like to do is, we said we want to warn the user that there's a problem. So we've received a forbidden exception. We know that there's a user because we've checked our identity attribute is not equal to null in this area here. Then we've grabbed the redirect and we want to go back to there. I want to redirect back to there with, and obviously this is the redirection here. But then we want to tell the user. So how do we do that? Well, we can use Cake. Let's have a look at flash message. So we go create a new flash message. And notice there that in order for us to work, we need to have a session. So it needs a session. And then once we've got the session, we can then do you do not have access to that. So right. Alright. So that looks like it will work. So we set the URL to the referrer and then flash a message to the user. Let's see if I've done that correctly. So let's go to posts. Again, we're still logged in as user, and then try and access something that we're not allowed to. Okay, now that's good. We're getting an error message, but every time we try to access it, we're getting two you're not allowed to access that thing. So why is that? Now there's something really interesting about this. Let's log out and log back in as admin. Notice when I log in as admin, I've got DebugKit toolbar down the bottom here. It works, everything's working with the DebugKit toolbar when I'm logged in as admin. But as soon as I log in as user, suddenly down the bottom of the screen, DebugKit is no longer there. And then when I hit edit, I'm also getting 2 flash messages. So what could be the issue there and how can we fix it? Well, it has to do with if we go down to our policies, the authorization policies, notice that we've got one for super user which says for the admin user, you're allowed everywhere. And when we're logged in as ourselves, the DebugKit toolbar is pretty much under that policy, under admin policy, and it's allowed. But as soon as we're logged into this RBAC policy, the user that's in that user role is getting denied, and ironically the policy that we're using for that user is basically being applied to DebugKit plugin as well. Now we could set a another policy within the permissions here, maybe to allow a user using the DebugKit plugin to work. But let's just do it as a policy in this policy chain. So how do we do that? So what we need to do is, all right, so I'm going to just do this from memory. Bin cake bake policy. Okay, I'm just going to go help on policies. So what I want to do is, well, the easy way to do this, let's go to the super user policy and have a look at, okay, so really that's what we want to do. We want to do another one of these policies, but we want to modify it for DebugKit. So if I go cake bake policy and I'll say allow DebugKit. Right. Now that, we go back up to our source directory, there should now be a policy directory, and all this stuff here we can get rid of and just paste in. Nope, I haven't got that there. Let's go back to here. We go super user policy, and we'll see what we can do here. So we go copy, go allow DebugKit. We've got all that selected. Now this one needs ServerRequest interface. ServerRequest interface. Okay. I think authorization, we'll just grab all of those. Right. Okay. Don't need that. That's not, because of course we created an entity policy, but it's not actually correct. Alright, so now what we need to do, we just need to say, right, it's a resource, but it's a request. So if we go here and we go resource get attribute, I think it might be plugin, equals DebugKit might be all we need. Let's try that. AllowDebugKitPolicy. Let's see if that works. So we'll just type in AllowDebugKit. Alright, so let's see if not yet. Let's see if I've got something. Here it is. Let's have a look and see if that's been triggered. Debug and die. Let's see if even we've got that correct. Reload. So that policy is not being triggered at all. So what do we need to trigger? Let's see what we've got to do there. All right. Now the problem there is we need it to implement policy interface, otherwise it just won't be applied, because it's vital. It won't. CakeDC, yep. All right, let's see now if that works. Okay, and so we've got another issue there. So it's not, it's param. I think that's going to be correct. Get param. Let's try that one more time. Right, what am I doing wrong there? So what I'm testing for is that in, it's been imported. It already has. Need to type in then that server request resource. So that's not returning our. Let's try get attribute, see if there's any. Oh, no, it's not going to work if, yeah, that looks correct. Now let's try that. All right. There we go. So now we're logged in as, we're definitely logged in as user, but now we've applied another policy just to allow all DebugKit requests so that we don't get second access denied. So we now, if we try and delete something, if we try and do that sort of thing, we can. But don't we want the user to be able to edit and delete their own posts. So let's now implement a policy with role-based access control that can do that. So let's go to permissions and just going to copy that for the user role posts. Now we want edit and we want delete. So those two things we definitely want the user to be able to do. Now we could write a function here that has, gets the user identity, gets the request, and gets all sorts of stuff passed into it, and then make some logic. But we don't need to do that because there's a nice class that is available called owner. So basically this looks at the record, the action, what the user is trying to delete or to update, and then says yes, this is the owner, and it returns that. So we just say that. So now we can go back to our posts, and as a user, let's see what happens. Okay, we're now allowed to edit and delete our posts. Let's make a change, log in as admin, create a new post, admin post, and then again log in as user, and then just give you the, you can see that, let's say again I try and delete the admin's post or edit the admin's post, I can't do that. So that's how we basically set up very rudimentary role-based access control based on, remember, the database table. It's a role field here, and that role you can apply obviously to dozens of users, and then group those users into a role and then give them individual permissions within the permissions PHP. Then you can use the owner class from CakeDC Auth plugin to decide whether a user can update, edit, or delete. Now going back to here, if we log in as create a new post, delete me, body test, and then we log in as admin. Let's actually create another admin user so that we can see that that's, so new admin 1, 2, 3, give that, but don't make them is super user. And let's log in as admin. And you can see that the permissions for the admin user, because we've set them in here as being able to go to these locations and do anything, they're not restricted. So you can really sort of see how you can start to mix and match those different permission PHP policies and get what you need. But the fun part is basically giving sensible feedback to the user and not allowing them to sort of be wondering, just handling the exception and going into the right place and saying, hey, you're not allowed to do that. So that basically is the role-based access control implemented using CakeDC Auth plugin and a simple array configuration and a redirect handler that sends the person to where they need to go. If you go back to source application, you can see that we create a series of policies that handle different requests, and obviously there's the server request, and it gets mapped against all these policies, and then you get a yes or a no from these policies, and if it goes all the way through, you get an access denied at the end of it. But the nice thing is that we're using a configuration here in the authorization unauthorized handler, which if there's no user, they get sent to login. But if there's a user and they're forbidden, then they get redirected to where they were, and then they get told that they were not allowed to access that action. So I hope that is of interest to someone.